Civic Engagement Brown Bag. My name is Amy Howard, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Civic Engagement, and I really want to thank you all for coming out. It is an incredibly gorgeous day out there, so the fact that you decided to spend your lunch hour indoors with shades down with us is wonderful, and I appreciate it. I'm just here to say welcome, 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 but I'm going to turn it over to my colleague in front of Glyn Hughes, the Director of Common Ground, who will introduce the framework for this panel and what we're up to, and also he will introduce our esteemed panelists. But just a note, for me personally, I have been thrilled to be a part of a larger group of faculty who've been coming together and talking about this concept in terms of racial justice and really grappling with how we can use our disciplinary perspective and training and background to talk about racial justice and what it means to do that. And what role could a liberal arts college have in thinking about these terms and taking our academic knowledge and using it in different ways, both on this community and in the greater community, in thinking about racial justice. So this is an experiment, and we're planting a seed today to see where and how we might go with our terms of racial justice. And I do want to acknowledge the work and input of a much larger group of faculty from all across the schools, actually, who've been a part of this dialogue. And some of those folks can be here today, but I just want you to know there's a larger presence that's been invested in this conversation and in this conversation moving forward. So thanks again for coming out, and I'm going to turn it over to Glyn.
Okay, thank you. It's nice to see everybody. So this is a panel discussion about racial justice, but also its opposite, racism. Trying to work a new technology here, so let's see. As an introduction, I just want to go over some of the thinking that motivated us to come together. And as Amy said, there are many others who have been involved in the discussion, and still many more who we hope to involve in the discussion and in the project as we move forward. So let's start this way. Racism is real, and few people today would dispute its existence. And yet, for the most part, racism is something very different than what most people think it is. Many, if not most people, believe or act as if racism is simply a problem of interpersonal relationships, right? And sort of from that belief, you can go to, well, I'm nice to everybody, and therefore I'm part of the solution. Still, there are other folks who believe that it's actually in talking about race or racism that we perpetuate. So white people probably believe these things more than people of color. But it is true that many people of color share these beliefs. It's even more true that these beliefs affect all of us and affect our ability to talk about race. The truth is, for us, the people who've been involved in this discussion, is that these and other beliefs not only constrain but contort our ability to talk about race and racism in really productive ways. And here now may be the hardest fact to swallow about this. To the degree that we misperceive what racism is, we also perpetuate it. And these are some of the things that motivated us to come together. We think that talking about race and racism is exactly what we need to do, but for the most part, we need to alter the terms of that discussion. Among the scholars of race across numerous disciplines, there's wide agreement that racism is a pervasively social, cultural, and psychological force. It's systemic in a social structural sense. It's unconscious. It affects the unconscious. And it haunts basically all aspects of our existence. This panel kicks off a new initiative on our campus that's designed to develop a vocabulary of racial justice that will hopefully help us to better perceive that full complexity of racism. The idea is to focus on concrete concepts drawn from bodies of academic knowledge and to make them accessible and usable to all members of the campus community. So here's the structure for today. Each panelist will introduce a single concept or term. And they have all agreed to do this in 7 minutes or less. And in front of everyone, I'll say I have my 1 minute left card.
He said he would try.
Eric's hedging now. He said he would try. No, but the idea is that we want to have ample room for discussion, and we're hoping to have a discussion that's both focused on these terms, but we also want to hear your ideas about this project, which we hope to continue. We will hold the comments and discussion until all of the panelists have presented their terms. And that's that. Okay. So first up is Bedelia Richards from the Sociology and Anthropology Department. Dr. Richards studies the experiences of Caribbean immigrants in the United States and the transition from high school to college among first-generation college students. In addition to teaching Introduction to Sociology, she teaches race, class, and schooling, sociology of education, the sociology of the Black experience, and capstone.
Thank you. When Glyn approached me about what concept I wanted to talk about today, I immediately thought about the concept of institutional racism, because I think that a very common perception that we have about racism is that it is on the individual level, right? And so, when we think about racism, we think about individual acts, hate crime, somebody spray painting something on a church, someone walking across the street when they see a Black or Latino male, things of that nature. And so, if we don't do that, and things like that don't happen anymore. After all, we have a Black president, then that means that there is no racism, right? So I wanted to talk a bit about what institutional racism is by kind of defining it the way that sociologists define it, and then perhaps using a few examples to illustrate what it is, and then at the end we could have more discussion about that. So in contrast to that individual, interpersonal level discrimination, institutional racism, first of all, it's discrimination, which it means kind of an action, right? Not necessarily prejudicial thoughts. It's carried out by social institutions, not necessarily by individuals. And by saying that, I think it's clear why there may be some confusion about what this thing is, because while we could all, I could imagine that all of us had images in our minds of someone crossing the street, it's very difficult to conceptualize, I don't know, a school getting up and walking across the street, right? I know it sounds kind of crazy, but I think the fact that it's carried out by social institutions makes it very difficult for us to conceptualize what that looks like. But that's part of the first thing that we need to take into consideration, is that it is actions or things that are carried out by social institutions. Well, if the school can't get up and walk across the street, right? Then how does that happen? Well, think about laws and social policies, right? This is one way in which institutional racism is carried out, through laws and social policies. Also keep in mind that instead of that individual act, that it is something that is systemic, right? So if we have, so it impacts any group or targeted group, minority group that may come in contact with that social institution, not simply that individual who goes to the restaurant and is not served, right? And that's just that one individual person, but anyone who comes into contact with that social institution is negatively impacted by that. And if we're talking about, race in this case, right, then it's any black person, regardless of whether or not that person is, high social, middle class, elite, or working class, right? The other aspect of it is that, and why it's so difficult to identify institutional racism, is that it typically is embedded in the normal and routine part of the way that an organization works. And so it becomes, that's something that's part of kind of everyday life. You don't necessarily question it. It's difficult to see and identify. And the other aspect of it that also makes it a little difficult is that we tend to think of racism as always necessarily being intentional, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it could be kind of the byproduct of certain actions that are taken. If it disproportionately impacts a particular group and harms them or restricts them in any way, it's still kind of that's institutional racism. Right. So with that kind of definition, I wanted to give maybe a few examples that perhaps could illustrate that. Some of them historically. When I talk about institutional racism in my classes, the examples that students tend to give are more along the lines of Jim Crow laws, right? That establish kind of racial segregation between blacks and whites, and that is an example. It illustrates the way in which it's embedded in laws, right? That dictate how what what restaurants people can go into, and so on. So that's one example of that, and that it didn't matter whether at that point how much money you had as a black person, that you were going to be impacted by that. So that illustrates that regardless of anyone who comes in contact with that institution will be impacted by that. So that's the one that tends to kind of resonates, I think, with a lot of folks, and one of the reasons why we tend to think that, well, that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. However, it could also be, something like institutional racism for me is also reflected in something like the GI Bill, but this is also another historical example. So, for example, this was a policy, but it's in contrast to the Jim Crow laws. This was supposed to be something that provided educational, higher education to World War II veterans and housing to World War II veterans. And in theory, that was supposed to benefit anyone, black, white, woman, and so on. But in practice, what happened was that many blacks and women were not able to take advantage of this right. And so a lot, if you talk to some of your grandparents or so on, or people in that era, a lot of folks experienced upward mobility, white Americans, as a result of the GI Bill. And so you could think about the implications of that. But that's also an example of institutional racism in the way in which it was practiced, right? Even though the law itself didn't say only give this to white people or only give this to men. Another less obvious example I could give also is the way in which we think about tracking, right? And this is one where whether you're black or white, you're talking about tracking in schools. A lot of us tend to kind of benefit from this practice, but it does disproportionately tend to negatively impact blacks and working class whites, right? But that may also be an example of how this is something that is embedded in the routine of the way in which schools operate, right? You take a certain exam. In theory, that exam tells you who is kind of the smartest or the most gifted, right? And that then allows you to place certain students in any kind of different levels within schools. However, that policy or practice disproportionately impacts black students, right? And the bias that may be embedded in the way in the measurement, right? The test that's being given. There are some other things that we can kind of talk about in the selection process. But in theory, the way that is supposed to work, it's really just supposed to allow teachers to differentiate, right, between smarter or gifted students and those who are kind of not. But again, this is an example of a way in which this policy or practice that is kind of an everyday thing that we don't think about has, on a larger scale, systemically, has a negative impact on black students and working class white students as well. So those are some examples, and we can certainly, I see I have my 1 minute card, so I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Eric Yellen, who is in the history department. Dr. Yellen's research is on the history of race and racism in the American state, and he teaches courses on 20th century American political and social history. Eric, go. Yeah,
go. So my term is actually one that encompasses a whole set of terms, just to make things as complicated as possible. When I talk about euphemisms in relation to race and racism, I mean ways of talking, sometimes even single words, that overlay racial questions, attitudes, or injustices. These are words that allow people, often well-meaning people, to avoid speech that is explicitly racist. Now, I'm a historian, so my terms are ones that have specific power in the past. And indeed, euphemisms are all about context. They work because they mean something clear, explicit, and agreed upon in a particular time and place. So, calling Barack Obama a food stamp president wouldn't reverberate in the same way in a country that doesn't have, say, a food stamp program, or in a society in which class and race do not overlap as often as they do in the contemporary United States. The term states' rights as a cover for segregationism also doesn't make sense unless segregationists can point to a federal government that is integrationist. States' rights, or defending your state against a central state, had no real political power until national politicians began to be a force for racial equality in the middle of the 20th century. Right, so we need to embed these terms, to use a popular word, or euphemism. While racial euphemisms draw their power and significance from very specific contexts, they are always, nonetheless, with us. My hope today is that as I describe one kind of euphemism that shows up in my own research, your mind will cast about to contemporary examples, contemporary discourse of these that include these kinds of terms. What words and phrases do we use today that have at the root assumptions and attitudes that support the kind of institutional racism that Dr. Richards described? So I'll give you my example. My own work is about the efforts of Woodrow Wilson's presidential administration to discriminate against African Americans in federal employment in the early 20th century. The history of the civil service is not exactly the world's most scintillating topic. I won't talk about how you take a test. But when we consider that black men and women were working at all levels of the federal government at the turn of the 20th century, from regular file clerks and copyists to presidential appointees and assistant attorneys general, and when we consider that federal offices were the only places in which educated black men and women could put their college and graduate degrees to use while earning decent paychecks in white-collar jobs, we can begin to see federal employment as a serious and nationally significant barrier to racism in a period in which things were getting much, much worse for most African Americans. As segregation and voter disfranchisement swept across the South and parts of the North in the 1890s, black men and women were building a middle-class community in the nation's capital. That was until Woodrow Wilson's administration went about systematically segregating federal offices and removing black men and women from federal positions of power and decent pay in 1913. In a period so racist, a period we associate with these Jim Crow laws that are so explicitly racist, you might think that Wilson's administrators simply stood up at a press conference and said, "We don't want black people in our government." But this was the age of progressive politics, and Wilsonians were the liberals. Woodrow Wilson ran on a platform of freedom, equality, and opportunity. He promised to reform the federal government so that it would serve the people, ordinary people, better. These were the good guys. And here's where we get our euphemism. Confronted by a black protester, somebody standing up against segregation in federal offices, Wilson explained that without segregation, quote, friction between white employees and the Negro employees will inevitably result. We are all practical men, Wilson declared. We know that there is a point at which there is apt to be friction. We must strip this thing of sentiment and look at the facts. Federal administrators had no intention of being unjust, Wilson explained. They have intended to remedy what they regarded as creating the possibility of friction, which they did not want ever to exist. You're catching the word friction, hopefully. Secretary of the Treasury William McAdoo told the NAACP, "There has been an effort in the department to remove the causes of complaint and irritation where white women have been forced unnecessarily to sit at desks with colored men. Compulsion of this sort creates friction and race prejudice. Elimination of such friction promotes good feeling and friendship," end quote. So this repeated use of the word friction was meaningful. It was an appeal to the kind of civil service reform that Woodrow Wilson had long advocated. It was part of what made him a liberal. On both sides of the Atlantic, in fact, mechanical metaphors of machines working well, efficiently, productively, without friction, became standard in progressives' discussions about institutions and bureaucracies, reflecting their hope that scientific management might bring order and harmony to American life. If we could just run things better, everybody would be happier. And indeed, friction was the enemy of efficient management. So an inefficient government is one in which no one wins, whether they be black or white. Progressives clung to notions of dissolving friction and promoting bureaucratic efficiency as essential to government reform. Efficiency is the hope of democracy, wrote the famed progressive Louis Brandeis. In the mouths of segregationists, this discourse turned white and black workers into mere colliding interests. That's a phrase from Max Weber, with segregation as the neutral solvent rather than an act of discrimination. Race friction as a concept erased the individuality of the people involved. It had a rhetorical power that insisted upon, and in fact, if said enough times, could naturalize the belief that black and white people could not be expected to get along as equals. It was this ability to further a racist assumption while also promoting a progressive agenda that gave this specific word so much power for Wilson. Perhaps most importantly, Wilson's call for smooth administration depicted anti-segregation activists as radicals demanding drastic change. It was African Americans, not white Southerners, who were creating friction by moving too quickly to alter the terms of American citizenship. Such a formulation performed a powerful erasure. Suddenly, 50 years of competent and peaceful black government service had never happened. There hadn't been years of black and white people working together in offices. To me, what's so powerful here is that if segregationists could make everyone believe that it was impossible, indeed totally nuts, to expect white and black people to work together, they could segregate while claiming to be just. They could segregate while claiming to be progressive. They could segregate while claiming to be merely interested in efficiency. They could ride a euphemism of efficiency right over the rights of black Americans. So it's euphemisms that make people demand justice. Euphemisms that make people demand justice look crazy, right? When people stand up and say, "I'm challenging this," and everybody goes, "That's not about you." Those are the ones that we really can expose and start to learn about how we think and how we operate.
Well, last up, Bert Ash from the English department. Professor Ash's research focuses on post-civil rights movement African America. He uses post-blackness, the black vernacular tradition, jazz, basketball, and black hair as lenses through which to study contemporary American and African American culture. He teaches courses on black style, post-soul literature and culture, and in the fall of 2012, he's teaching international jazz and American culture.
I'm going to give you 6 bullets on the term post-race. 1, I live in a but then again world, a nevertheless world, and yet world. And whether you realize it or not, so do you. 2, here's a quotation by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Some of you may have heard this before. Quote, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." 3, when the work of scholars and social scientists becomes known to the American populace, things sometimes get lost in translation. For instance, the word closure. I'm going to read 2 sentences. "The government forced the closure of the factory." That's one. Here's the other one. "We all felt a sense of closure after our sister's murderer was sent to jail." The word is the same in both sentences. The representation of the word differs wildly. The family of the sister who was murdered is simply not going to feel as if the matter is closed once the murderer is in jail. But a lot of Americans consider the word closure to be synonymous, to be exactly the same as closing the door. Or The 5 Stages of Grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross from her 1969 book, Death and Dying, denying, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. They don't always happen in that order. People get stuck on certain steps, and yet the popular way of looking at that kind of doesn't quite match what Kubler-Ross actually meant. 4, the usage of the term post-race exploded when Barack Obama was elected president. People needed a way to verbalize the idea that Obama's election was evidence that things were different now in this post-civil rights movement era, so they began to use post-race. Here's the problem. Post-race is a term that describes an era. It's not meant to be taken literally. Post, we were all taught in elementary school, is a prefix that means after, which is confusing enough. But in this case, post doesn't mean after, it simply means altered or different. The reason African Americans, among others, get upset with people who use post-race as if it means race doesn't matter anymore, we're post-race, is because race still very much matters. Think of it this way. Post-race is one thing. Post-racist is another. Many people, most of them in the racial majority, seem to desire an era when race doesn't matter anymore. So they're delighted with and cling to the idea of us being after race so that they can use the word post-race as if it means after race. But we're not after race. And yet the racial reality in this country is indeed altered or different nevertheless. My Fitzgerald quote, that whole two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time. Well, 5, black folk and others, some of whom are in the majority, will often use present-day racist incidents as evidence that things haven't changed. They'll use present-day racist incidents as evidence that things have not changed. And often enough, those are good examples of how we're not after. But the Trayvon Martin shooting in Florida, and I hope that most of you are familiar with it. I don't want to go into detail. A young man was shot and killed in Florida a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. The Trayvon Martin shooting in Florida is actually an excellent example of how, yes, we are not after, but we are also different. This incident is the reality of post-race. It's messy, it's confusing, it's seemingly contradictory, it's difficult to pin down. In some ways, this whole thing, referring to the Trayvon Martin incident, is as heartbreakingly familiar as air. In the Deep South, a black boy simply goes to the store and doesn't come back alive. Police botch the investigation. They seem not to value this boy's life in the same way that the shooter seemed not to value this boy's life. That sounds like it's 1953 or 1921 or 1897. The problem is the facts about the case seem to speak to how things are different or altered. And I'll quote from the Washington Post this morning. George Zimmerman is biracial, this is me. George Zimmerman is biracial, born in 1984 to a white father and a Latina mother. As the Washington Post reported this morning, quote, "There may be no box to check for George Zimmerman. No tidy way to categorize, define, and sort the 28-year-old man whose pull of a trigger on a darkened Florida street is forcing America to once again confront its fraught relationship with race and identity. The victim, we know, was named Trayvon Martin, an unarmed black teenager in a hoodie. The rest becomes a matter for interpretation. The drama in Florida," the article continues, "takes on a kind of modern complexity. Its nuances show America for what it is steadily becoming, a realm in which identity is understood as something that cannot be summed up in a single word." But see, there it is. And I hear in that last clause the desire to have this complicated post-race reality, quote, summed up in a single word, and it's not going to happen. 6, I'm going to quote from a New York Times op-ed from last week by Thomas Chatterton Williams. Quote, "Now we inhabit a vastly different landscape in which mixing is increasingly on display. In just 3 decades, as a new Pew Research Center study shows, the percentage of interracial marriages has more than doubled from 6.7% in 1980 to approximately 15% in 2010. And some 35% of Americans say that a member of their immediate family or a close relative is currently married to someone of a different race. Thanks to these unions and the offspring they've produced, we take for granted contradictions that would have raised eyebrows in the past. As a society, we are re-evaluating what such contradictions mean, unquote. And that's it right there. In this opinion piece that never actually uses the term post-race, Williams is describing the process of the U.S. dealing with a volume of racial and cultural mixture that is unprecedented. This op-ed was masterful. I suggest you read it. It's titled, "Black as We Wish to Be." And what's wonderful about it is that he refuses to buy into the idea that this vastly different landscape is in any way settled and calm and after. Williams, the writer of this op-ed, is the son produced from an interracial marriage. His father is black, his mother is white. He appears to identify as black. He's also recently married a white woman. And the way he closes his op-ed is telling in its recognition of a post-race reality and also his recognition that things are not settled. Quote, "When I think about what my parents endured, the stares, the comments, the little things that really do take a toll, I am grateful for a society in which I may marry whomever I please and that decision is treated as mundane. Still, as I envision rearing my own kids with my blonde-haired, blue-eyed wife, I'm afraid that when my future children, who may very well look white, contemplate themselves in the mirror, this same society, for the first time in its history, will encourage them not to recognize their grandfather's face." The hinge word, the key word in this paragraph is still, as in nevertheless, or but then again, two opposed ideas in play at the same time with the hope that we as a country will retain the ability to function. And that space right there, that messy, contested space, that's the post-reality in which we live, whether we like the word or not, and whether we use the word or not.
Thank you all very much. So want to open up discussion, and as I suggested, want to focus on these concepts that were presented, the idea of this initiative in general. To elaborate on our idea, it's to regularly add to this list of terms through similar kinds of sessions, but to also maintain a way of cataloging these terms in an accessible way so that there's this ability to reference it and elaborate those terms and have them grow. The objective is to better enable our community to ask the hard questions that will move us collectively closer to a vision of racial justice, not post-race, but progressively closer. I realize that you're likely tempted to raise a wide range of questions and topics, but I'd like to ask first for questions that are about clarifying these terms before we launch off into applicability and all of that. So if you have questions for the panelists about, I don't understand what you meant by that, why don't we start there? Open it up.
I guess in thinking over myself about racial euphemism and trying to come up with my own examples, I was thinking of maybe are they all by nature negative, or are there some positive racial euphemisms as well?
Positive in what way?
I mean, that's the thing, because like to help me define them, because I found it hard to come up with some like examples in my own head to help me better understand. I just wondered if by nature then they're all negative because they allow people to be racist without being overt, or if there are ways for people to use racial euphemisms without it being negative.
It's really interesting. I'm so focused on the negative.
Scientists, that's what we do.
Yeah, right. That's a really, I mean, I think I think that if you here's one. I'll give it a crack at it, but you've pushed me off my comfort zone. So, but if you think of a word like family, which people will use to encompass, and it's a euphemism for all kinds of things, for connections and for relationships, and some of which are kin and some of which are biological or not. And I think that's a positive, right? It's a euphemism that could cover over some things that maybe we want to cover over to indicate love. So maybe there could be a positive euphemism, but I have to think more about it.
What about the word ghetto?
That's like the one euphemism that ghetto and ratchet. Well, those were the two that kind of came into my mind.
Oh, so you mean like reclaimed
Lost me,
euphemism?
ratchet.
No, it's just that I was trying to maybe think of. I guess I was trying to come up with positive ones, but then in my inability to, I was wondering if that means by nature that racial euphemisms are negative.
And if the way I'm thinking about it is a euphemism that can do what I would consider to be racist work.
Okay.
Right? So work that in some ways allows a racist system to continue without people who really think of themselves as fair really having to question that. So in that way, yeah, I think it is negative.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Good question. It struck me that all of us wanted to take our term and then say, but it's very messy.
As good.
Yeah, right.
If you don't ask questions, I'm going to get in trouble. They're going to say you should have allowed us 15 minutes each. Okay. Yes.
All right, I have a question back beyond. So when we're talking about racial euphemisms, is it reasonable to say that these euphemisms that we use presently could be intersectional and that they apply to race and or class and or et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah.
Because the one I'm thinking about is like
Yeah.
pull yourself up from your bootstraps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which does a lot of work, and it's attached to individualism, which has class, and I think that part of the difficulty here, we've actually talked about this in this, is to try to separate things like class, gender, and race, and you can't. And euphemisms can do a lot of the work for burying what should be connections that need to be interrogated. When I was thinking about euphemisms, I was thinking about welfare queen, right? Which is class. It was racialized in the 1980s, and it's gendered, right? The presumption that it's a woman who's bilking the system, right? So that, yeah, I mean, that's what's so amazing to me about them, and we can spend hours just getting upset.
I have maybe a question that I was going to ask all of the panelists to comment on the Trayvon Martin case, because it seemed like we could talk about euphemisms and institutional racism and post-race through that case. So maybe even, I don't know, Bedelia, if you have thoughts about how you see institutional racism playing out in the Trayvon Martin case.
When I think about institutional racism playing out in this case, I think about the role of the police officers, right, or the criminal justice system, and how the kind of expectations that we have about how they go about carrying out justice. The messiness that comes into play, the messiness I think that kind of comes into play is when we think about, think for a second. When I'm thinking about the individual who kind of commit, the individual act that was committed, I think one of the ways in which we see kind of a group being targeted is when we think about all the outcry, right, that kind of comes from that. In this case, it seems that if it's a situation that's between this kind of Zimmerman and this young man, and I think the way in which we see institutional racism playing out is, to what extent would the police department, right, as an institution, how would they have treated not just this individual, but this individual representing a particular group of people differently if he were not black? Would we have valued that individual and that group's life, right? Just as much as we would someone else. It's the way in which the police department itself kind of carried out the investigation, and the ways in which it reflected kind of a differential value on human life based on the race that person, of that individual. And I think that's why we saw such kind of a group outcry, because for every black woman, man, they could see their own son, brother, easily being the victim of that, right? And that's where that we could see that kind of institutional nature coming in, that whoever you are of that group, and you come into contact with that institution, the police officers or the criminal justice system, that could have been the likely outcome. The similar treatment being the devaluing of black life, right? And the ways in which you kind of follow up with that. So that's the way that I see institutional racism playing out, and the way in which we just think about it as more kind of, but it's just these two individual people. But it's not. It's also about how justice was carrying out. But anyway, I'll kind of leave it at that, and we can, because I think that there's lots more to say.
Just to add to that, my understanding is that the young man was on suspension from school, which is why he was at his father's house. And everything I've heard over the last several months about these studies that say that young black men are far more likely to be suspended for things that young white men aren't, means that it's entirely possible that if those sorts of institutional views of suspensions in school were equally distributed, he wouldn't have even been there in order to go to the store and get killed on the way back. That's another sort of institutional way of looking at his mere placement in that community at all.
Well, I think the other thing that I thought about, and Zimmerman was not a police officer, so it's not as easy to come up with, kind of racial profiling. But to a certain extent, that's all, from the evidence that I've heard in any case, it seemed like, there was a bit of kind of profiling, right? Targeting this young man because of the way that he looked. So I think that's another way, even though he himself was not a police officer, but I think the institution, the legal system kind of, I think in some ways reinforced or supported his profiling of this young man. So I think that's another way in which we could kind of think about it, and that's where the messiness comes in, right? Because he himself was not necessarily a police officer. It doesn't make it as, it's not as easy to then kind of think about, well, what are the recourses? If he were a police officer, I think it would be easier to think about how to, how to address that issue. And that's where the messiness, I think, come into play here.
I'm struck by stand my ground. The law, which
yes, law.
as a euphemism, because it's a law that you probably know the 21 states have, in which essentially it's been a long piece of criminal law that you can claim self-defense if you're defending your property. And stand my ground law says that essentially wherever you are is now your property, and you have a right to defend that ground essentially at any cost. And that, to me, is an amazing euphemism about property and about who has a right to be where. Because essentially, the police have to make a decision about who had a right to be there, right? And that the assumption that the person who shot the gun had some kind of ownership over that space, and that Trayvon Martin was therefore, by definition, imposing himself, is fascinating, right? And these laws have names because they're powerful, and they do a lot of work. But there was actually a question.
Yeah, I was just going to, what Dr. Richards was talking about, would you then be able to extend that institution over into like the media as far as profiling? Would you say that that's, because we were talking about, we were talking about the education process as well as the police, but doesn't the media as an institution also kind of project these stereotypes or these profiles?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we look at who, the face of the criminals, right, that tend to kind of appear on television, that then give us an idea, that help or reinforce the idea of who is a criminal, right? And so when we think about criminals and then we associate that with a particular group, yeah, I think that's one of those institutions that help to reinforce in our own minds what a criminal looks like, right, and who we may think of as threatening. And so, yeah, I do think that that's one of the ways in which it's reflected.
So in order to change the institutional racism at that level, do we have to affect the institutions, or do we have to affect maybe like the larger culture? Like, maybe that's a question that you can't answer, but yeah. Is there a way to affect the institutions that could be positive? I mean, if we're talking about federal government response during certain eras, I mean, it's been very positive against racism as well as pro-racism at different times. I'm thinking of the military in particular. It's been just as powerful for as against. So do you think it's possible to affect the larger culture by affecting the institutions? Anyway.
I do think that it's possible to affect the larger. I do think that it's possible to affect the larger culture. If we think, even though it's difficult for me to think about, the how-to part of it, but there's an optimism in me that there is a way of. One of the things that I was thinking of, for example, with the Trayvon Martin case, is that if we think, if we have the mindset of it's really not possible to change the institution, then one of the things that I think that would happen is that there wouldn't be that protest, right? Because what I've thought about is what would happen if there was not protest against what happened, and I don't think that I don't think that the federal government would get involved. There wouldn't have been kind of, even if we think about the media as being, racist, it's still highlighting and it's also transmitting information that we are aware of, right? So I think that there is certainly, in terms of changing the institutions, I think that there is a lot of power kind of grassroots in individuals collectively kind of coming together and mobilizing, right? And I think that's where we have the power to kind of change institutions in that sense. Not necessarily, I don't have much faith in more kind of the top down personally. I think that we have to act in a way that's going to force that change. So that's one of the ways that I see that the institutions can enact some change. I don't know if you can say any other thoughts.
Yes, I see a hand back there.
How would you confront Zimmerman's apologists? There are people out there who justify the help. What would you help? These are not rational actors, right?
Yeah, I couldn't hear the end of.
I'm saying there are people out there who would justify the killing. They would defend Zimmerman. And when you talk to them, what would you tell them?
I would like to, if you're familiar, if you could elaborate what some of those defenses are, so that we can respond to what do people say in defense of Zimmerman.
For instance, where they call into question that Trayvon Martin was suspended because, not for tardiness, but again, euphemisms that maybe he did something more than being just tardy to class, and they go on, and the sense is that Trayvon Martin, he's a thought he didn't deserve to die, but he's dead, and we've got bigger fish to fry. There's this sense in a lot of right-wing websites, if you'll go online and stuff.
Or I've also heard of people saying, "What was he doing wearing a hoodie in Florida?" Like that's gang. Like it must be gang-related for someone to be wearing a hooded sweatshirt in Florida. That's okay.
I'd say, I don't answer those sorts of assertions. If I can't make any sense of what someone is trying to argue, then I don't see the benefit in attempting to answer them, because anything that I say that makes sense to me, they're not going to respect, and they're not going to make sense of for them. So I mean, it's an interesting question, but I simply would have no answer to someone who would assert that. I would just simply say, I guess we just see the world differently, and shrug. And if that makes me a bad race man, I'm gonna have to wear it.
One of the more, I guess, sensible assertions that people have been making in Zimmerman's defense is that he was captain of the neighborhood watch. And so he claimed that he would have followed Trayvon was an unknown person to him, not because of his race, but because he was a suspicious person to him. I mean, in the 911 phone call that he made, he did remark upon race, but I mean, they've been saying that he would have followed anyone because this is a gated community. He's never seen this person before, and that he did follow Trayvon, but the officers on the phone told him not to confront him. So when the shooting occurred, he was on his way back to the car, and Trayvon attacked him. And that's why it was in self-defense, and it was in defense of himself, and that's why he pulled out his firearm. And that is definitely not something that I agree with, but that's something more sensical, or something more like, not quite as outlandish as he was wearing. To me, that's outlandish in my opinion. And it's something that's a lot more sensible. And then the reason why the police chief has stepped down and has decided not to really step into it, because he feels like he said that, like, he is quoted as saying that he doesn't feel like Zimmerman committed a crime, and those are the reasons why. Like, what would you say to something like that?
See, let me just say real quick, and then I'll kick it back to you. This is the sort of thing, I mean, I would say, if I wandered into those waters, I would just say, look, the guy was quoted on the phone as using the term fucking coons to describe who he was dealing with. Now, as far as I'm concerned, if somebody wants to hold a good faith argument where they try and justify what he did and say it wasn't race, and then they're made aware of the fact that race is in the mix from his mouth, and they continue to argue, then there's no solving that person's mindset. Because race is in the mix. It's clearly there. Do you know what I mean? If he hadn't said that, they might have something to stand on. But it's my view that what happens is, and this is increasingly a problem in terms of the sort of public discourse in this country, and it's nothing new, but it is what it is. People have their preset points of view, and then they take evidence in order to get what they already think out into your head. And you, not you, but generic you, have kind of presets, and you take your own evidence, and then you push back, and there it is. That's why I don't have those conversations, because they're really not about the subject itself. They're about something else that's been happening for a long time, and people take their positions, and then they try and go. And if no one is really having a good faith argument, which is what I think is an important couple of words to put in front of the word argument, then it's really just a proxy for a centuries-long game that really has no winners.
I think we've gotten the signal that we're nearing the end, and I want to sort of make a comment about this discussion that also talks about this initiative, which is fundamentally about trying to change the nature of the conversations that are possible. And I think that one of the things that we would want to resist in these kinds of discussions, or be suspicious of, if I can use the word suspicious, right? So, is individualizing explanations, right? Or rationales or explanations of the situation that go down into the individual level of what Trayvon was doing or what Zimmerman was doing. There's part of what we need to do is sort of step back and recognize that this kind of thing is part of an ongoing recurrent pattern in which black men are subjected to violence in public, often by public officials, over and over and over, and that the pattern does not seem to deviate from that. And so then to step back and say, okay, what might explain this recurrence, right, over and over and over? I mean, we could name numbers of it. James Byrd, Rodney King, Emmett Till, Oscar Grant, Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima. All of these are names of people who've been similarly persecuted over the, And so the question, shifting the terms of the question to the, what are the forces, the institutional forces, the kinds of euphemisms and the beliefs about race that make that pattern possible? And that's, I think, what we're hoping that these kinds of terms enable, a shift in the discussion that gets us out of that individualizing stuff. That said, I'm really curious to hear in the last few minutes if anybody has suggestions for what we would do next with this initiative. Does this seem worthwhile? What would you change? What would you add? Yeah.
I personally see this as, because conversations like these tend to happen among the same people, and it's not among, just talking about our University of Richmond community, maybe making it something more public, making it something where the people who may not want to think about it, forcing everyone, forcing the university community as a whole to think about it. Because though they may not see themselves as being impacted on it personally, it's an institutional thing. And unless we have kind of the support and the participation of the entire university as a community, then we can't hope to enact change in this smaller community and then change in the world as a larger community. So I think something like making it more public, making it more open, making it where you don't have a choice but to see it, then that will open discourse among people who don't know these terms, who aren't using these terms on a daily basis, who aren't even having these conversations, who aren't thinking about this at all.
Okay, thank you.
Off of what Joelle was saying, just incorporating it into the MLK Day commemoration, I think is a great way to kind of kick this off, because we're already in that mindset on that day, and a lot of people do come out to the celebration. So this could be a great segue, or that day could be a great segue into actually getting these conversations amongst a lot more people than are in this room right now, and a lot more students as well.
Do we need to? Can I?
I'll look at this last agenda.
Okay.
And then we can talk informally after.
And there is an email that if you have comments or questions about the initiative, you can feel free to send them to that email address. Yeah.
My comment is basically, when we're talking about, especially with Trayvon's case, that when we're looking at institutional racism, euphemisms, post-race, what have you, these terms, that it tends to be drawn out to such an extreme, like this is an extreme act, when in reality on this campus it happens every day, little microaggressions. And I think it's important that we don't forget that those little pieces happen when we're focusing on very blatant acts. So that would be my suggestion.
Please, if you want to stick around and our panelists have a few more minutes, we could continue an informal discussion, but the CCE is ultimate timekeeper, so. I know students have to go to class, but I just want to say again, I'm really hopeful because there are a large number of people in this room on an 85-degree day. Your comments and questions lead me to believe that this is the beginning of a really important and timely initiative at our campus. And I encourage everyone who's here to send an email about what you thought about this, what you'd like to see, because that will inform not only the faculty here, but the much larger group of faculty who've been trying to have a conversation about what this could look like on our campus and in the larger Richmond community. So thank you very much for your time, effort, and energy today. Have a good week.